Tyron Woodley is the undisputed UFC champion who has defended his belt 3 times since winning it against Robbie Lawler back in 2016. But for some reason, he doesn't receive the respect a UFC champion usually gets. In fact, a lot of people don't like Tyron Woodley at all, but what's the reason for that? Hey guys, it's Keon, and today I want to talk about UFC Welterweight champion Tyron Woodley. I remember watching Tyron Woodley when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast. He was telling Joe how fighters like Carlos Condit, Robbie Lawler, Stephen Thompson are all receiving more respect than him even though he's the UFC Welterweight champion. But Joe Rogan dismissed these comments and said it was totally nonsense. But does Tyron Woodley have a point? Do MMA fans not respect him? Tyron Woodley made his debut in 2013 after Strikeforce merged with the UFC. He made easy work of Jay Heron by knocking him out 36 seconds into the first round. He went on to fight Jake Shields where he lost a split decision, which I actually thought he won. He rebounded by knocking out Josh Koscheck in one of the worst knockout losses Koscheck has ever received in his career. This win set him up with top contender Carlos Condit. At this time, Carlos was a huge fan favorite in the UFC, mostly because every fight he was getting into became brawls. So of course, when the fight went down, many wanted Carlos to win. But when Woodley went for a takedown, he landed on Condit's knee, and as a result, Carlos blew out his ACL. When the fight went back to the feet, Tyron attacked the legs, and Carlos ended up falling to the mat in pure agony. Woodley was awarded the TKO, but many fans weren't happy about it. People were saying how Woodley got lucky, and if Carlos never got injured, he would have won. To me, this sparked the dislike towards Tyron Woodley. People weren't happy to see Carlos Condit lose, and I feel many took it out on Woodley. After dropping a decision to Roy McDonald, he went on to win back-to-back fights against Don Young Kim and Kelvin Gastelum. This streak led to a scheduled bout with former champion Johnny Hendricks at UFC 192. Winner of this would determine the #1 contender, but Johnny Hendricks was forced out of the fight because of weight-cutting complications. Woodley at this point considered himself the #1 contender, but I don't think that sat well with many fans. People believe Tyron didn't deserve to fight for the title due to Johnny Hendricks being pulled out of their #1 contender fight. But nonetheless, the UFC set up Woodley against champion Robbie Lawler at UFC 201. Robbie Lawler came in as a favorite, not only in the odds, but by the fans. He came off of 2 of the greatest title fights in UFC history when he fought Roy McDonald and Carlos Condit. At this point, fans loved him and were expecting the same type of brawl with Tyron Woodley. But Woodley shocked the world when he knocked out Lawler 2 minutes and 12 seconds into the first round. It was upsetting for many who were huge fans of Robbie Lawler. This also made some fans dislike Woodley even more. His first defense was against karate fighter Stephen Thompson at UFC 205. The fight was super competitive and ultimately ended in a majority draw. Even though Woodley didn't win, it still sparked some interest from the fans who were excited for the rematch fight. Prior to the rematch at UFC 209, Woodley had complaints that his second fight with Thompson wasn't being promoted well by the UFC. He also complained that the UFC was making Stephen Thompson look better than him. This led to Tyron Woodley claiming that racism had hindered his career and the careers of other black fighters. In an interview with MMA Junkie, Woodley said, "I've beat so many guys that have great brands and great reputations. How do you beat that person and technically consume their talent and consume their power? Then you're still this fighter that's not a high-profile Carlos Condit, Robbie Lawler, Paul Daly, Josh Koscheck. You can even say that competing against Wonderboy. How do I have to continue to excessively prove myself and always be the underdog? I don't get the respect I deserve, and that leads me to believe that maybe it's a color issue. Look at guys like Demetrius Johnson, who's the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world. Why isn't he on the largest pay scale? Why are there people that aren't even champions making more money? It's embarrassing that fighters in our generation, and it's not the promotion, don't get me incorrect. I'm not saying it's the UFC and that there's such a huge conspiracy, but the mindset of our fans. We indirectly make preconceived notions about certain fighters. Tyron has all this muscle and he's going to fade out in the later rounds. I think we subconsciously have these opinions and we don't even know we have them. Think about it. The second John Jones slipped on the banana peel, granted he's his own worst enemy, but they can't wait to throw him underneath the bus. People of different races are given several chances. I'm by far the worst treated champion in the history of the UFC. Blatantly facts. There's no think, it's complete fact. Dana White responded to Woodley with, "Tyron, that's great and stuff, great stuff. You fought to a draw in your last fight. Finish it, finish the fight." He was resilient, it was that type of fight, it was a back and forth fight, it was an amazing fight, it was a draw. If that's what you want people to focus on, is what a stud of a champ you are, then go in there and finish it on Saturday night, and no one will be questioning you whatsoever. Dana White also called Tyron Woodley a bit of a drama queen and said he should be more like lightweight champ Conor McGregor, who's eager to take on all corners. White said Woodley should also bring a more consistent message to fans and stop arguing with them on social media. Furthermore, Dana White denied Woodley's claim that racism had hindered his career, saying that that the company has many black fighters. The back and forth continued when Woodley said, "How is Dana White gonna call me a drama queen? He's the biggest drama queen. I learned from the best." Woodley followed up by saying he would never imitate McGregor to gain stardom and added he'd accomplished his goal of bringing the issue of racism to the forefront of the sport. The beef between Dana and Tyron would lead to many MMA fans backing Dana's statements in that Tyron Woodley is a drama queen and he uses the race card as an excuse for not being respected as a champion. UFC 209 was headlined by Woodley and Thompson, but unfortunately the second fight didn't live up to the first one. Both fighters were hesitant to attack, leading to very minimal striking throughout the fight. In the end, Woodley retained the belt by majority decision, but almost everyone wasn't impressed with his performance, especially UFC President Dana White. Dana thought Stephen Thompson won the fight and went on to say, "Woodley came out and made some big claims before the fight that we were gonna have a definitive answer on who is the champion and things like that. I like Tyron. He's talented. You've heard me say all the things he is. You can't be upset at people now or whatever after that second fight." Woodley was scheduled to defend his belt against jiu-jitsu practitioner Damian Maia at UFC 214. Woodley went on to defeat Maia by unanimous decision, stopping all 21 of Maia's takedowns and generally outlanding the jiu-jitsu ace. Woodley also claimed that he torn his labrum in the first round of the fight, limiting him to using his offense. But much like Woodley's last fight, the fight with Maia was received poorly by fans. Dana White was not a fan of the performance, putting the blame on Woodley, saying he definitely could have finished that fight in the second round, but he didn't want to take the risks. In response, Tyron Woodley demanded a public apology from the UFC president and made a threat that he was going to start leaking some shit. Yeah, no one really knows what that shit was, but it was probably really good. Finally, Woodley put the beef to rest by saying, "There was some yelling back and forth. At the end of the conversation, I felt pretty comfortable. It ended on a positive note. Two men can talk on the phone and maybe not agree on everything, but at least respect each other." Now that I've stated some of the facts, here's my opinion on Tyron Woodley. Unfortunately, in his UFC rise, he had to fight many fan favorites, and I think it left a sour taste in their mouths when Woodley beat them. In regards to the UFC not pushing Woodley enough, I do have to agree. They don't promote him as the dominant champ that he is. I get that his last two fights weren't the most entertaining, but we have to understand that he was fighting very dangerous fighters. Stephen Thompson is a counterpuncher. If you attack him too quickly, he can catch you and knock you out. Damian Maia is one of the best jiu-jitsu fighters in the UFC. If Woodley overcommitted on any attack, he could have easily been taken down and dominated on the ground. I think Woodley fought smart, and I can't really hate him for that because the stakes are high. UFC pay is much more as a champion, so a fighter would do anything to take the W and keep that belt. For the people who are hating on him, why isn't Stephen Thompson or Damian Maia receiving the same negativity? I mean, it takes two to tango, so we can't just blame Tyron Woodley for these fights not being entertaining. And to be honest, many of Maia's and Thompson's fights are boring in general, so it shocks me that people don't call those guys out and just put the blame on Woodley. Woodley says race may play a part of him and other black fighters not being promoted well enough, and honestly, he may be right. If you take a look at other black champions, Demetrius Johnson and Daniel Cormier, they too don't receive the promotional push from the UFC. Demetrius Johnson is the most decorated fighter in UFC history, yet no one seems to care. And I have to put the blame on the UFC, who's not pushing Demetrius' name as much as they do with other fighters. Daniel Cormier became popular mostly because of his feud with Jon Jones, but even he still gets disrespected by MMA fans. When Daniel Cormier wrestled Anderson Silva to a unanimous decision at UFC 200, fans were absolutely booing him, but they cheered Brock Lesnar, who fought with the same game plan against Mark Hunt on the same card. The same could be said with Kamaru Usman, who is a dominant wrestler in the cage, but the UFC doesn't push him as well. But when we had GSP around, the man who was notorious for striking or wrestling his way to decision victories, he was praised and is now considered one of the best of all time. Now I know what you're thinking. What about Jon Jones, Anderson Silva, and Francis Ngannou? I think those three became big stars because of their unorthodox style, which led to many incredible finishes. But the question is, what if these guys didn't fight the way they did? What if they wrestled or boxed their way to decisions? Would they have become the stars that they became? My honest answer is no. People dubbed John, Anderson, and Francis as freak athletes. Tyron Woodley made a good point that he doesn't like when people label him as a freak athlete because he thinks fans would just see that attribute as the only reason he can win fights. He made it clear that he wins fights because he trains hard on his cardio, striking, and wrestling. Overall, he's smart in his decision making in the cage, but people don't recognize those as reasons for him winning his fights. The common theme with Daniel Cormier, Demetrius Johnson, Kamaru Usman, and Tyron Woodley is that these are fighters with strong fundamentals. But for some reason, that isn't enough for the UFC to push them. But what about a fighter like Khabib? Strong fundamentals that lead to decision victories for the most part. Why is he being pushed so much? In my opinion, I think it's wrong for Dana White, as a boss to Tyron Woodley, to be dismissing his claims of racism. In fact, I think it's wrong for anyone to dismiss Woodley on this topic. For people to say he's a diva or he's playing the race card, how do you know? Only Tyron Woodley knows because he's actually living through it. So why are people questioning how Tyron Woodley feels as a black UFC champion when they themselves aren't going through the same experience? After all, this is the guy who was told by his boss to be more like Conor McGregor and not himself. My name is Keon, and this was my take on why I think people hate on Tyron Woodley. Do you agree, disagree, or have something else to add? Please put it down in the comments below and I would love to read it. If you like this video, please give it a like because it would help me so much. Also, be sure to hit that subscribe button right over here for more videos like this one. And also hit that notification bell so whenever I do release a video, you will be the first to know about it. That's all I have for this video. I'll see you on my next one.